A dying millionaire asked a homeless girl to pretend to be his daughter for a day. That same day, his biological daughter, who he thought was dead, appeared. What happened next? The Johnson mansion stood tall on the outskirts of the city, a silent monument to success and sacrifice. Its marble walls, adorned with intricate Victorian details, seemed to tell a story of power and grandeur. Yet the echo that reverberated through its vast halls was not one of celebration, but of deep loneliness. Victor Johnson, once known as the most visionary magnate of his generation, spent his days confined in this opulent prison. His figure, now fragile and hunched, was far from the imposing presence he once projected. Sitting in a worn leather armchair by the large fireplace in the main hall, he held a framed photograph in trembling hands. A little girl with dark hair and bright eyes, captured in a moment of happiness. Laura, his Laura. The portrait was a constant reminder of the tragedy that shattered his life. More than 2 decades had passed since the accident that took his daughter, and though time had moved on, the pain remained, rooted in every corner of his being. Victor stared at the image as if trying to unravel some hidden secret, as though the answer to his torment was there, waiting to be revealed. The hall, filled with carefully preserved memories, was a testament to his inability to let go. The shelves were lined with books that Laura used to leaf through, though he had never had time to read them with her. The piano in the corner gathered dust, silenced since the day he lost his daughter. Everything spoke of a life that had been suspended, trapped in time. As the crackling fire filled the space, Victor closed his eyes and let the memories flood him. He remembered Laura's childish laughter, the afternoons he promised to spend with her, but sacrificed for work, and the last words she said to him before that fateful boat trip. "We'll be back soon. I promise I'll spend more time with you this time." A vow he never kept. Inside him, something stirred. The terminal illness that consumed him had granted him a cruel clarity. He knew his time was short. And with that certainty came a desire that seemed irrational, but inescapable. He couldn't leave this world without feeling, even for a brief moment, the illusion of having his daughter by his side again. Victor rang the bronze bell resting on the table beside his armchair. The sound echoed through the hallways, and minutes later, Clara, his housekeeper, appeared, followed by Marcos, his personal assistant. Both looked at him with a mixture of concern and reverence, aware of his increasingly fragile state. "Mr. Johnson, do you need anything?" asked Marcos, bowing slightly. Victor looked up, and for a moment, his eyes seemed to regain some of the intensity they once had. "I want to find someone," he said in a deep, measured voice. "I want you to find a girl who could be like Laura. Just for one day." Clara and Marcos exchanged puzzled glances. The request was strange, even for a man who had endured so much loss. But the determination in Victor's eyes was unyielding. "Are you sure, sir?" Clara asked cautiously. "Don't you think this might be too painful?" Victor shook his head, clutching the photo frame as if it were a lifeline. "I can't go like this," he replied, his voice breaking for a moment. "I need to feel like she's here, just for one day. That's all I ask." Marcos nodded, acknowledging that there was no point in arguing. The task would be difficult, but if it was Victor's last wish, there was no room for questions. As night fell over the mansion, Victor was alone again, staring at the fire dancing in the fireplace. A flicker of hope, though faint, ignited in his heart. Perhaps in some way, this act could close the circle of his life. But what he couldn't foresee was that his search would bring not only the echoes of a past he thought lost, but an unexpected twist that would change everything. The large windows reflected his silhouette as the full moon illuminated the gardens outside. There was an air of anticipation, as if something important was about to happen. And so, with a desire that defied logic, the final chapter of Victor Johnson's life began. In a forgotten corner of the city, neon lights flickered weakly over an alley where time seemed to have stopped. Among the rubble and faded graffiti, Emma, just 17, moved with the agility of someone who had learned to survive in a hostile environment. Her dark, tangled hair fell over her face, hiding eyes that, though young, carried a hardness beyond her years. With small but quick hands, Emma offered trinkets to passers-by. Bracelets made from recycled beads, rag dolls, and other items she collected and restored. Each sale meant one more meal, one more day away from the hunger that constantly lurked. Adults passed her by, avoiding her gaze. Some deliberately ignored her, others barely noticed her presence. But Emma was used to it. She had learned not to expect anything from anyone. Her refuge was a corner in a nearby alley where a thick cardboard box and a worn blanket became her bed when night fell. There she shared space with Tigre, a stray cat who had become her only constant companion. Tigre, with his mottled grey coat and bent tail, was a street warrior just like her, and together they formed a strange but solid alliance. That night, the cold air seeped through the cracks in the buildings. Emma lit a small fire in an old drum, using pieces of wood and paper she had collected during the day. As the fire crackled weakly, she took out an old notebook and a chewed pencil from her bag. Drawing was her escape, her way of turning the harsh reality into something magical. In her sketches, Emma became a hero, a warrior with a shining sword, fighting dragons and rescuing kingdoms. She drew landscapes full of color, worlds she had never seen but longed for with all her soul. When she finished her drawing, she looked up and stared at the night sky. The stars, barely visible among the city lights, reminded her of her mother. Though the memories of her family were blurry, she still remembered her mother's soft voice singing songs to her before bed. But those days seemed part of another life, one Emma no longer allowed herself to remember often. Holding on to them only made her more vulnerable, and in the streets, vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. As the fire slowly died out, a thought crossed her mind. How much longer could she keep going like this? It wasn't the first time she asked herself that, but that night, the cold seemed crueler and the weight of loneliness more oppressive. Tigre, curled up beside her, lifted his head and looked at her with his bright yellow eyes, as if he understood her thoughts. "We're fine, Tigre," Emma murmured, stroking his rough fur. "We don't need anyone." But deep down, she knew it wasn't true. There was a void in her heart, a longing she couldn't fully suppress. It wasn't just the desire for hot food or a roof over her head. It was something deeper, more essential. Emma dreamed of a place where she could feel safe, where she wouldn't have to look over her shoulder or fight every day for survival. That small spark of hope was the only thing keeping her going. A quiet but persistent inner voice told her that maybe, just maybe, her life could change someday. Though Emma didn't know it, that change was about to arrive in a way she could never have imagined. As she extinguished the fire and settled next to Tigre, Emma closed her eyes, letting sleep wrap her in a fragile blanket filled with impossible dreams. Life, with its cruel sense of humor, was about to offer her an opportunity that seemed as magical as the tales she invented in her drawings, but one that would also force her to confront her deepest fears. The morning in the city opened with the deafening noise of cars and the voices of street vendors. At the same corner Emma had occupied for months, the winter sun weakly illuminated the asphalt as she offered her trinkets with a calculated air of resignation. Dressed in an oversized coat and shoes that could barely be called such, Emma persistently approached passers-by, hoping to gather enough for food that day. "Bracelets! Only 20 pesos!" she exclaimed, holding up a bundle of colorful beads. The responses, when there were any, were quick glances, head shakes, or more often, complete disdain. Amid the constant flow of hurried people, a man stopped in front of her. He wore a dark coat that seemed expensive and carried a pristine leather briefcase. He didn't fit the grey, worn surroundings, and his presence stood out immediately. Emma noticed him, but at first she didn't pay much attention. Many curious people stopped just to judge her or ask useless questions. However, this man didn't keep walking. He stood still in front of her, watching her with a gaze that wasn't of contempt, but of evaluation. His eyes seemed to be searching for something in her, something Emma couldn't quite grasp. That unusual attention sparked her mistrust, a natural reflex of someone who had learned to survive in a hostile world. "Are you going to buy something or not?" she asked, with a challenging tone and narrowed eyes. The man smiled slightly, as if Emma's attitude didn't intimidate him at all. "I'm not here to buy," he said, leaning slightly toward her. "I'm here to make you an offer." Emma took a step back, clutching her trinkets against her chest. Street offers were rarely what they seemed, and she wasn't willing to fall into a trap. "What kind of offer?" she replied, looking at him suspiciously. "A job." The man lowered his voice, as if trying to convey seriousness. "It's simple. You'd spend a day in a mansion, hot food, a place to sleep, and monetary compensation." Emma raised an eyebrow, half surprised, half skeptical. The proposal sounded too good to be true, and that put her on alert. "And what would I have to do?" she asked, her tone full of skepticism. The man seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if searching for the right words to explain himself. "You'd have to act. Pretend to be someone else for one day. That's it. After that, you're free to return here or do whatever you want with the money." Emma studied him closely, searching for any sign of danger. Her life on the streets had taught her to read people, to detect lies in their words or hidden intentions in their gazes. But this man, though mysterious, didn't seem threatening, at least not in the way other adults usually were. "Why me?" she finally asked, with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Because I think you have what it takes for this job," he replied, offering no further details. "What do you say?" Emma crossed her arms, torn between caution and temptation. The promise of hot food and a bed was attractive, but something inside her held her back. She had learned that nothing in life came without a hidden cost. "I'm not stupid," she said, fixing her eyes on his. "If this is some kind of trap, I won't stay quiet." The man smiled again, this time with a glint of respect in his gaze. "It's not a trap, it's an opportunity, but the decision is yours." After a few seconds of tense silence, Emma sighed and nodded, though with visible reluctance. "Fine, but if anything weird happens, I'm out." The man nodded in agreement and gestured toward a black van parked nearby. Emma quickly packed up her things, casting one last look at Tigre, who watched from a distance as if judging her decision. Before getting into the vehicle, she stroked the cat and murmured, "Wait for me here. I won't be long." As the van pulled away from the corner, Emma couldn't help but feel anxious. She didn't know what she was getting into, but for the first time in a long while, the day seemed to hold something different. Maybe it would be good. Or maybe she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Only time would tell. The van slowly made its way along a cobblestone path that seemed endless, flanked by tall cypress trees that rose like silent guardians. Emma, sitting in the back seat, gazed out the window with wide eyes, trying to hide her astonishment. Street life hadn't prepared her for a place like this. Every kilometer they traveled took her farther from everything she knew. When the vehicle stopped in front of wrought iron gates, Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. The gates opened with a metallic sound, revealing a mansion that looked like it had stepped out of one of the old magazines she used to find in the trash. The structure was imposing, with marble columns, giant windows, and perfectly manicured gardens stretching in all directions. Emma tried to keep a neutral expression, but her lips couldn't help but part slightly. Victor's assistant, who hadn't said more than 2 words during the ride, stepped out of the car and opened the door for her to get out. Emma slid out of the seat, adjusting her old coat as she nervously glanced around. "This way," the man said, pointing toward the mansion's main entrance. Emma followed him with cautious steps, feeling terribly out of place. As she crossed the foyer, the contrast between her appearance and the luxury surrounding her became painfully clear. The marble floor reflected her image, her worn shoes echoed in the spacious area, and the walls adorned with artwork seemed to judge her silently. When they reached the grand hall, she found herself face to face with an older man seated in a leather armchair. His face, marked by the wrinkles of age, showed a mix of expectation and vulnerability. It was Victor Johnson. Although his body appeared frail, his dark eyes still held an intensity that seemed to pierce Emma's soul. For a moment, no one spoke. Victor studied her closely, as if searching for something in her, something he wasn't sure he would find. Emma, uncomfortable under his gaze, crossed her arms and raised her chin in a defiant gesture. "Is it you?" Victor asked finally, his voice trembling but firm. "I suppose so," Emma replied, her tone trying to sound indifferent, though she couldn't avoid feeling small under his gaze. Victor nodded slowly and leaned on the cane beside him to stand up. He walked toward her with hesitant but determined steps. When he was close enough, he extended a trembling hand. "Thank you for coming." Emma didn't know how to respond. Around her, everything felt like it had come out of a strange dream. The sparkling chandeliers, the heavy curtains, and this man who looked at her with a mix of hope and sadness. "Well, it's not like I had many options, right?" she murmured, lowering her gaze for the first time. The assistant intervened to break the tension. "I'll show you to your room. You can prepare yourself there." Victor watched her leave, and as Emma followed the man through the mansion's hallways, she couldn't help but glance around. Every detail of the place was a display of wealth that she couldn't understand. Carpets softer than any bed she'd ever slept in, hand-carved furniture, and vases that seemed too expensive to even look at. Finally, they reached a room decorated in warm tones, with furniture that looked like it came straight out of a fairy tale. The bed, with its velvet duvet, was the most impressive thing Emma had ever seen. Although she tried not to show it, she couldn't resist running her fingers over the soft fabric. "You can change here. You'll find clothes in the wardrobe," the assistant said before leaving, closing the door behind him. Emma was left alone in the room, staring at her reflection in a huge mirror. For the first time in a long while, she had a moment to stop and look at herself. Her hair, dirty and tangled, fell in rebellious strands over her face. Her clothes, too large and patched up, seemed like a mockery in this setting. She opened the wardrobe carefully, as if afraid she might break something, and found dresses and shoes she'd never imagined wearing. Despite her initial resistance, curiosity won over. She chose a simple but elegant dress and put it on with trembling hands. When she looked at herself in the mirror again, she could hardly recognize herself. For a moment, she allowed a spark of emotion to fill her chest. What did all this mean? Who was this man? And why had he chosen someone like her for this strange job? Though her thoughts were filled with questions, Emma couldn't ignore the feeling that this place, with all its luxury and mystery, was the beginning of something much larger. As she left the room, ready to face whatever came next, she had no idea that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The morning sun shyly filtered through the large windows of the main dining room, illuminating a long table covered with an immaculate white tablecloth and surrounded by high-backed chairs. Emma, wearing the dress she had found in the wardrobe, felt like a character out of place in a movie scene. Her attitude, however, was still one of distrust, with her shoulders tense and her hands intertwined in her lap. Victor, sitting at the head of the table, watched Emma with a mixture of curiosity and nostalgia. There was something about her, in her defiant eyes and the way she moved, that reminded him of Laura when she was a child. Although he knew he wasn't seeing his daughter, he couldn't help but project memories onto this stranger. Breakfast began in silence. The table was adorned with a variety of foods Emma had never tried. Golden croissants, fresh fruits arranged like works of art, and a jug of juice that seemed freshly squeezed. Though her stomach rumbled, Emma barely touched her plate at first, more out of distrust than lack of hunger. "This was my daughter's favorite place to have breakfast," Victor said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Emma looked up, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. She hadn't expected him to speak so openly, let alone about something so personal. "Your daughter?" she asked, unsure if she was crossing a line. Victor nodded, his eyes fixed on the garden that stretched beyond the windows. "Laura. We used to sit here every morning when she was little. She loved the freshly baked bread. She used to say the smell was like a warm hug." Emma didn't respond immediately. Something in the way he spoke, with a mix of tenderness and sadness, disarmed her slightly. Although she tried to remain distant, she couldn't ignore the weight of the pain that seemed to surround the man. "It must have been nice, having someone make you breakfast every day," Emma murmured, unable to hide a hint of envy in her voice. Victor looked at her, catching the meaning behind her words. There was something in this girl that not only reminded him of Laura, but also spoke to him of a different kind of loneliness, one he had felt in recent years. "Do you like bread?" he asked, trying to change the subject with a faint smile. Emma nodded, and finally, she dared to take a croissant. The first bite surprised her. It was warm, crisp on the outside, and soft on the inside. For a moment, she forgot where she was and let the taste envelop her. The rest of breakfast passed with an unexpected calm. Though there was still distance between them, small gestures began to fill the silence. Victor served her tea, asking if she liked it with sugar, and Emma, though somewhat uncomfortable, began to respond with longer sentences. It was as if they were both testing unfamiliar ground. After breakfast, Victor took her to the backyard garden, a large space full of exotic flowers Emma had never seen before. There were stone paths winding through rose bushes, ponds with colorful fish, and a greenhouse that seemed to contain a world of its own. Victor walked slowly, leaning on his cane, but his voice grew more animated as he pointed out different plants and shared stories about how he had cultivated them with Laura. "This one was her favorite," he said, stopping in front of a jasmine bush in full bloom. "She used to say the smell was like a whisper from the stars." Emma, who had been keeping a certain emotional distance, approached the bush and took a deep breath. The scent was soft, delicate, and for a moment, she could imagine what Laura had felt being here. The afternoon continued in the library, a place that left Emma breathless. The walls were covered with books from floor to ceiling, and a grand wooden staircase slid up to the higher shelves. Victor took a book of tales and asked Emma to pick one at random. "Laura and I used to read here together," he said, handing her the book with a faint smile. "Would you like to try?" Emma hesitated for a moment, but eventually took the book and began to read aloud. Although at first her voice was shaky, little by little, she gained confidence, losing herself in the words. Victor closed his eyes, listening with a peaceful expression he hadn't felt in years. When the sun began to set, they found themselves on a balcony that offered a panoramic view of the gardens. They sat in silence, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. Victor, his eyes fixed on the horizon, spoke softly. "Thank you for this day, Emma." She glanced at him sideways, feeling a strange warmth inside. Though she had started the day with distrust, she couldn't deny that something in this man had touched her heart. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel alone. The sun slowly disappeared, leaving a blanket of stars over the mansion. And although many barriers remained to be broken, they both shared that moment as if two souls had found comfort in the midst of the emptiness. The dawn filtered through the heavy curtains of the room where Emma had spent the night. The bed, soft as a cloud, had been an unknown luxury for her, but also a source of unease. Her body was accustomed to the cold floor and rough blankets. The softness of this bed had almost kept her awake, as if she didn't belong in this world of comfort. Still barefoot, Emma slipped out of the room and wandered through the hallways of the mansion. Everything in the place felt too big, too silent. The walls were covered with family portraits, shelves filled with old books and objects that, although beautiful, seemed to have been untouched for decades. One of the portraits caught her attention, a girl with dark hair and a radiant smile, clearly younger than Emma. She wore a white dress and held a bouquet of flowers, standing next to a younger man Emma recognized as Victor. It was Laura, the lost daughter. Her gaze seemed to follow Emma as she walked down the hall, and Emma felt a strange chill as she realized how much space this girl still occupied, even in her absence. Further ahead, she found a half-open door leading into a music room. Inside, a piano covered with a white sheet seemed to be the centerpiece. Emma, unable to resist her curiosity, lifted the sheet to reveal an instrument that, though covered in dust, still seemed majestic. She pressed one of the keys, producing a soft, nostalgic sound that echoed through the room. Suddenly, a voice behind her startled her. "Laura used to play that piano." Emma quickly turned around and saw Victor standing at the doorway, leaning on his cane. His face showed no anger, just a melancholic acceptance. "Sorry," Emma said, stepping away from the piano. Victor slowly moved toward the instrument and ran his hand across the polished surface, as if caressing a memory. "When she was little, she used to make up songs. She said the piano could speak if you listened carefully. She would always ask me to play along, but I—" His voice broke slightly. "I never did. I was always too busy." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with things that didn't need to be said. Emma, who usually didn't know what to say in situations like this, felt the urge to speak. "Maybe," she started, hesitating. "Maybe it's not too late for someone to play." Victor looked at her with a mix of surprise and gratitude, as if those simple words had reached a deep place in his heart. But instead of responding, he changed the subject. "There's something I want to show you." Emma followed him to a small room in the east wing of the mansion. It was simpler than the rest of the house, with shelves full of children's books and a table covered with papers and colored pencils. On the table rested an open photo album filled with pictures of Laura at different stages of her life: her first birthday, her first day of school, afternoons in the garden. "She was my life," Victor said, almost in a whisper. "Everything I built, everything I did, was for her. But I wasn't there when she needed me the most. And when she disappeared, it was like my world stopped." Emma, who had always believed love was a luxury reserved for others, found herself moved by Victor's words. She had never met anyone who spoke with such passion and pain about someone else. How was it?" she asked, afraid she was crossing a line. Victor sighed and sat down in a nearby chair, as if the weight of the question had weakened him. "An accident, a boat trip. It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon on the water. I wasn't there, of course. I had a meeting. I was always in a meeting. When they called to tell me she had disappeared." He placed a hand over his face, as if trying to hold back tears. "I never found her body. Only the emptiness." Emma felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to say something, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, she moved closer to the album and looked at one of Laura's photos. There was something in her smile, something warm and bright, that somehow made Victor's pain even more tangible. "It must have been incredible," Emma finally said, "having someone who loved you so much." Victor looked up, surprised by the sincerity in her words. In that moment, he understood that although Emma was not Laura, she too carried an absence, a void that had shaped her. The day continued with more walks around the mansion. Victor showed her the greenhouse, filled with plants he had personally cared for, and a corner of the garden where Laura used to play. Although the stories he shared were tinged with sadness, they also carried a glimmer of hope, as if sharing these memories with Emma returned a part of what he had lost. When evening fell, Emma found herself sitting next to the piano again, while Victor watched her from his armchair. She played a few random notes, creating a simple yet comforting melody. Victor closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the space. In that moment, They both shared a strange understanding, a silent connection that didn't need words. The echoes of the past still resonated throughout the mansion, but for the first time in a long time, they were not completely alone in facing them. Night had fallen over the mansion, enveloping every corner in a solemn stillness. Emma, unable to sleep in her room, decided to venture through the halls once more, driven both by curiosity and an unease she couldn't shake off. The mansion, so silent, seemed like a different place in the dark, and every creak of the floor beneath her feet echoed like a whisper in the vastness. Finally, her steps led her to the library, the place that fascinated her the most. With its mysterious air and scent of old wood, it was a refuge Emma was beginning to appreciate. The shelves, filled with books that probably cost more than anything she had ever seen in her life, made her feel small, but not in an unpleasant way. Instead, they gave her a sense of awe, as if each book held a secret waiting to be discovered. As she browsed the shelves, a particularly dusty corner caught her attention. There was a wooden box, worn but clearly valuable, resting in a forgotten corner. Curiosity, her eternal companion, flared instantly. Emma looked around to make sure she was alone before approaching. Carefully, she slid the box to the floor and opened it. Inside, she found a pile of letters, all tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was old, with slightly yellowed edges, but the handwriting, written in black ink, was clear and firm. What caught her attention the most was the recipient. All of them were addressed to Laura. Emma picked up the first letter and began to read it. Victor's handwriting was elegant but trembling, as if each word had been written with the weight of an emotion he couldn't contain. "My dear Laura," the letter began, "today was another day without you, and the emptiness you left keeps growing. Time doesn't heal everything. Whoever says that has never truly loved. I search for you in every corner of this house, in every shadow, in every sound, hoping for a miracle that will bring back your smile. Forgive me for not being there when you needed me most. Forgive me for all I didn't do." Emma felt a lump in her throat as she continued reading. Each letter was filled with love, regret, and heartbreaking pain. There was something so raw and honest in these words that Emma couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by a mix of sadness and admiration. She had known many kinds of loneliness in her life, but never something as deep as what these letters reflected. She turned the pages slowly, almost reverently, as if accessing a part of Victor he had carefully kept hidden. Each letter was a silent scream, a plea to someone who would never return. Emma didn't know how much time had passed, but when she looked up, her eyes were filled with tears she hadn't known she had. She carefully closed the box, making sure to leave it as she had found it. For a moment she thought about keeping her discovery to herself, but something inside her told her that these letters, although private, were an important key to understanding Victor and the pain that consumed him. That night, as she returned to her room, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Victor's words. For the first time, she understood that her presence in the mansion wasn't just some whim of an old man, but a desperate way to fill a void left by an irreplaceable daughter. Although she was not Laura, Emma began to wonder if, perhaps, she could offer something more than just an act. Maybe, just maybe, she could help Victor find some peace in the time he had left. With that thought in mind, Emma lay down, knowing that the weight of those letters was now also a part of her story. And as sleep enveloped her, the echo of Victor's words continued to resonate in her mind, more alive than ever. The morning rose over the mansion, bringing with it a light fog that enveloped the gardens in a dreamlike air. Emma, still reflecting on the letters she had read the night before, stepped out onto the balcony to observe the grounds before her. The flowers, trees, and cobblestone paths reminded her of a world that was not hers, a world built for someone who had disappeared long ago. Victor appeared shortly after, moving slowly but decisively. His cane gently tapped the ground with each step. When he saw her, he gave a small smile. "Would you like to walk through the garden?" he asked, gesturing toward the pathways. Emma hesitated for a moment, but eventually nodded. Something inside her told her this walk would be more than just a simple stroll. As they walked among the flower beds and trees that seemed to whisper stories to the wind, Victor began to speak. His voice, though calm, was heavy with emotion. This place was Laura's favorite spot. Every part of the garden holds a memory of hers. Victor stopped in front of a wooden bench beneath a towering oak. "We used to sit here and read stories in the afternoons." "Well," she read, "I tried to, but my mind was always on business. I always thought I'd have more time to be with her. But time is a cruel liar, Emma. It makes you believe there's enough when, in reality, there never is." Emma listened in silence, letting his words sink in. Though she had never had someone like Laura in her life, she understood what it was like to want more time, more opportunities, something that never arrived. Victor continued walking, pointing out various corners of the garden. Talking about Laura seemed to ease his burden, and for the first time, Emma began to ask questions. "What did she like to do here?" she asked, pointing to a pond filled with koi fish. Victor smiled faintly, a glimmer of nostalgia in his eyes. "She used to throw coins in and make wishes. She had a whole list of dreams, to travel the world, to write books, to learn to play the harp. I always told her she could accomplish anything." He stopped and sighed. "But I didn't give her enough time to try." They approached the pond, and Victor took a coin from his pocket. He extended it toward Emma. "Make a wish." Emma looked at him, surprised. She wasn't a child who believed in wishes or magic, but something in Victor's gesture made her take the coin carefully. She closed her eyes and thought of what she wanted most, a place where she could be herself, a place where she didn't have to fight to survive each day. When she tossed the coin into the water, she watched it sink slowly to the bottom. Though she didn't truly believe wishes came true, she couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope inside. The walk continued until they reached a smaller tree surrounded by wildflowers. Victor pointed to a metal plaque at the base of the tree where Laura's name was engraved. "This is her tree. We planted it when she turned 10. She said she wanted it to grow with her, to be as tall as her dreams." Emma, moved by the story, approached the tree and gently touched its trunk. It was young but sturdy, as if Laura's strength still lived within it. "It's beautiful," she murmured, not exactly knowing why she felt the need to say it. Victor nodded and remained silent for a moment, watching how the breeze moved the tree's leaves. "Thank you, Emma," he said finally, "for listening, for being here. I don't say it often, but I appreciate it more than you can imagine." Emma didn't respond immediately. Victor's words were sincere, and though part of her still felt like an imposter, another part was beginning to believe that her presence was truly helping this broken man. As they made their way back to the mansion, the sun began to peek through the clouds, bathing the garden in a warm light. For Victor, the walk had been a small step toward peace. For Emma, it had been a reminder that, despite her own wounds, maybe she could offer something to someone else. That day, they shared not only stories, but also a little bit of hope. And though the shadows of the past still lingered, the Garden of Memories had become a place where, at least for a moment, they could find solace together. The day was beginning slowly at the mansion. The soft morning light slid through the windows, illuminating the antique furniture and silent hallways. However, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Clara, the housekeeper, had observed the last few days with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She had served Victor for decades, witnessing his transformation from a powerful, determined man to someone consumed by grief and loss. Emma's arrival had brought something new, something Clara couldn't quite label as hope or as a dangerous risk. From the kitchen, Clara could hear the occasional laughter of Victor, something she hadn't heard in years. Despite her initial joy at seeing a change in her master, there was something about Emma that unsettled her. It wasn't the girl herself, but the situation. To Clara, Victor's fragile heart was playing with fire. Later, while Emma sketched in a corner of the main drawing room, Clara decided to approach her. The girl was absorbed in her work, her pencil moving quickly over the paper. The drawing showed a portrait of Victor, but not as the frail old man he was now. Instead, he appeared young, with a face full of determination and vigor. Clara couldn't help but be moved. "You have talent," she said softly, making Emma look up in surprise. "Thank you," Emma replied, feeling a little uncomfortable under Clara's gaze. The housekeeper sat in a nearby chair, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment she said nothing, simply observing Emma with a serious but not hostile look. "I want you to know something, child," Clara began, her tone firmer now. "Mr. Johnson has been through a lot. His heart is already too broken. If you're here for the wrong reasons, if you decide to hurt him, you could shatter what little he has left." Emma frowned, feeling a mix of discomfort and anger. "I'm not here to hurt him," she replied, her voice stronger than she intended. "I don't even know why I'm here." Clara looked at her silently for a moment, evaluating the sincerity in her words. Finally, she nodded, though her expression didn't soften entirely. "I hope so," she said, standing up, "because he's already lost too much." As Clara walked away, Emma stayed where she was, feeling a knot in her stomach. The housekeeper's words had not only unsettled her, but had also stirred something within her, a feeling of guilt she couldn't ignore. Though she had initially accepted being there out of necessity, she was now beginning to realize that Victor saw her as something more, as a spark of life in the middle of his sadness. Later that day, Victor found Emma in the garden, sitting beneath Laura's tree. The girl held the drawing in her hands, but this time she seemed lost in her thoughts. Noticing her expression, Victor approached and sat beside her. "What's wrong?" he asked, with genuine concern. Emma took a moment to respond. Finally, she handed him the drawing. "I was drawing you as I think you looked before," she said, almost in a whisper. When everything was different." Victor took the drawing and studied it in silence. His eyes, usually filled with sadness, brightened for a moment. "It's beautiful," he finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "You make me look like the man I used to be, someone I don't quite remember anymore." Emma looked at him, feeling a strange weight in her chest. There was something about Victor, about his vulnerability, that made it impossible to maintain the emotional distance she had tried to build. "Victor, do you think you could be happy again?" she asked, with a sincerity that surprised them both. The man looked at her, thoughtful, before answering. "I don't know, Emma, but I want to believe that there's still room for something like happiness. Maybe not the way it was before, but something different, something new." At that moment, Emma realized that even though she was not Laura, her presence was having an impact on Victor. Perhaps she couldn't fill the void left by his daughter, but she could offer him something different, a bridge to peace. As the sun began to set, Emma and Victor sat in silence under the tree, sharing a moment of genuine connection. However, Clara's words continued to echo in Emma's mind, reminding her that her place in this story was more complicated than it seemed. And though she wanted to believe she was doing the right thing, she couldn't ignore the shadow of doubt that now weighed on her heart. The night stretched over the mansion like a heavy cloak, and inside her room, Emma sat on the edge of the bed, her hands intertwined and her gaze lost on the floor. Clara's words kept resonating in her mind, like an insistent echo she couldn't ignore. Was she really doing the right thing by staying here? Or was she just complicating the life of a man who already carried so much pain? On one hand, Emma knew she had entered this agreement out of sheer necessity. The promise of a warm place, food and money was more than she had had in a long time. But with each passing day in the mansion, with each conversation with Victor, something inside her had begun to change. She could no longer see him only as a rich and desperate man. His pain was real, deep, and his desire to connect, even through an illusion, was something Emma couldn't ignore. She closed her eyes, trying to sort out her thoughts. She had spent so long hardening her heart, building walls to protect herself from the world, that now she felt exposed, vulnerable. The mansion, with all its luxury, had begun to erode those barriers, and that scared her. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the mansion, Victor was also awake, sitting in his study surrounded by photographs and letters he had never dared to fully open. His mind was tangled in a web of contradictory emotions. Though he knew that Emma was not Laura, he couldn't help but feel something for her, a connection he didn't entirely understand. In her presence, he felt a glimpse of what he had lost, a spark of life amid his sadness. But he also knew it wasn't fair to Emma to carry his ghosts. The next morning, during breakfast, the tension between them was palpable. Emma barely touched her food, and Victor, noticing her distraction, decided to speak. "Are you okay, Emma?" he asked, his tone mixing concern with tenderness. Emma looked up, surprised by the question. For a moment she thought about saying everything was fine, that there was nothing to worry about, but Clara's words resurfaced in her mind. "I'm not sure," she finally admitted, leaving her fork on the plate. "Sometimes I feel like I don't belong here, like I'm not what you need." Victor looked at her in silence, letting her words settle before responding. "I'm not looking for you to be Laura," he said, with a sincerity that surprised Emma. "What I need, what I want, is a chance to remember what it means to care for someone, to share moments I thought I'd never have again." Emma turned her gaze away, struggling against the confusion she felt. "But I'm not your daughter," she murmured. "I don't know how to help you." Victor extended a hand and gently placed it over hers. "You don't have to be Laura to help me, Emma. Your presence here is already more than I could have asked for. But if, at any moment, you feel like this isn't right for you, I won't keep you here. I just want you to be honest with yourself." His words, though reassuring, also stirred a new conflict in Emma. For the first time, someone was giving her the option to choose her place in the world. She wasn't used to that. In the streets, decisions were always a matter of survival, not choice. Later, while walking through the gardens, Emma reflected on what Victor had said. For the first time, she began to consider that maybe, just maybe, her presence in the mansion wasn't just a means to get what she needed. Perhaps she was also learning something about herself, about what it meant to connect with someone. When the day came to an end, Emma sat beneath Laura's tree and took out her sketchbook. She began to trace lines, creating a portrait of Victor as she saw him now. A broken man, yes, but also someone willing to open his heart, even knowing how fragile it was. As she finished the drawing, a soft breeze stirred the leaves of the tree, and Emma felt an unexpected calm. For the first time, she didn't think about running, about returning to the streets. Maybe, at least for a while, she could find a purpose here, something more than mere survival. The dilemma still lingered in her mind, but that night, as she closed her eyes to sleep, a small spark of hope began to kindle. Maybe this place, this relationship with Victor, could be something more than a temporary arrangement. Maybe it could be a beginning. The morning began with a deceptive calm at the mansion. The gardens, bathed in the winter sun, seemed frozen in time, while Emma helped Clara gather flowers for the main dining room. Victor was in his study, going through a box of memories he had never dared to fully open. Everything seemed to be unfolding in a tranquil routine until a sound broke the monotony, the engine of a car approaching along the cobblestone path. Clara was the first to notice the arrival of the vehicle. A sleek black sedan stopped in front of the mansion's gates, and from it, a woman with dark hair and a determined presence stepped out. Although time had changed her features, Clara recognized her immediately. Her breath caught, and the vase she was holding nearly slipped from her hands. It was Laura. With a mixture of disbelief and nervousness, Clara rushed out to meet the visitor, her steps hurried and shaky. Laura, now a woman in her 30s, looked at her with an expression combining determination and doubt. It had been so long since she left this place that it now felt strange, almost foreign. "Clara?" Laura asked, her voice laden with suppressed emotions. Clara nodded slowly, her throat dry with surprise. "Miss Laura, is it really you?" she murmured, her eyes filling with tears. "It's me," Laura replied, letting out a deep sigh. "I'm here to see my father. I need to talk to him." Clara didn't know what to say. So much time had passed, and Laura's return was something no one, not even Victor in his most desperate dreams, had ever considered possible. But regaining her composure, Clara nodded and opened the main door to bring her inside. In the study, Victor was lost in his thoughts when Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Mr. Johnson," she began hesitantly. "What's wrong, Clara?" Victor asked, lifting his gaze. Before she could answer, Laura appeared behind her. Upon seeing her, Victor froze. His eyes, which had seen years of solitude and regret, now looked at his daughter with utter disbelief. For a few seconds, which felt like an eternity, neither of them spoke a word. Finally, Victor whispered, as if afraid that saying her name would shatter the illusion, "Laura?" She nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, sadness, anger, and deep, deep longing. "It's me, Dad." Victor tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't respond. Despite his frailty, he made a desperate effort to approach his daughter. I thought you were dead," he said, his voice breaking. "I know," Laura replied, her tone cold, cutting through the air. "And I suppose you accepted that idea quickly." The comment left Victor speechless. His daughter, the child he had lost, was now standing before him. But her tone was not one of joy or reconciliation. It was one of reproach. Before he could say anything, Laura continued. "More than 20 years have passed, Dad. More than 20 years where I was alive. And you went on with your life as if I didn't exist." Victor shook his head, tears beginning to roll down his cheeks. "No, Laura. I never moved on with my life. I never stopped looking for you, waiting for you." Emma, who had been listening from the hallway, appeared just then. The scene before her was almost unreal. Victor, broken with emotion, and Laura, a woman who seemed to carry years of pain and resentment. When Laura's eyes landed on Emma, her expression hardened even more. "And who is she?" she asked, pointing at the girl with a gesture of disdain. Emma, uncomfortable under Laura's gaze, tried to speak, but Victor interrupted her. She's Emma." He paused, trying to find the right words. "She's helped me cope with your absence." Laura's face darkened, and her tone grew colder. "So you brought her here to replace me?" she accused, her voice laced with bitterness. Victor shook his head in desperation, moving toward Laura as much as his frail body allowed him. "It's not like that, Laura. I could never replace you. Emma. She's given me company, reminded me of what it means to care for someone. But I've never stopped loving you or thinking about you." Laura looked at him, her face showing an internal struggle between resentment and the desire to believe him. Without saying another word, she turned and left the study, leaving Victor and Emma in a silence thick with tension. Later, while Clara tried to comfort Victor, Emma found Laura in the garden, standing next to the tree she had planted with her father. Though she didn't know what to say, Emma approached slowly. "He never wanted to forget you," Emma said with an unexpected bravery. "Everything he does for you." Laura didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the plaque with her name, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I don't know if I can forgive him, but seeing him now, it hurts more than I thought it would." Emma, still not fully understanding the complexity of the father-daughter relationship, could only nod. Sometimes, pain is the only thing left. But it can also be a beginning. Laura looked at her, surprised by the maturity of her words. Though there was still a barrier between them, they shared a moment of unspoken understanding, a small but significant step toward what could be reconciliation. The main hall of the mansion became the epicenter of an emotional storm that afternoon. Laura stood by one of the windows, her silhouette outlined against the faint light coming through. Her expression was a mixture of contained rage and latent pain, while Victor remained seated in an armchair, his trembling hands resting on his cane. Emma watched from a corner, too afraid to intervene, but unable to ignore the tension filling the air. "How could you give up so easily?" Laura demanded, suddenly turning toward her father. "How could you accept that I was dead without even fighting for me?" Victor lifted his gaze, his eyes moist and filled with regret. "I didn't give up, Laura. I searched for you, for months, for years. I hired teams, spoke to authorities, reviewed every report, every lead, no matter how small. But all I found was silence." His voice cracked. The pain was unbearable, and my body, my mind, they just couldn't take it anymore. Laura crossed her arms, clearly dissatisfied with his answer. "Is that it? You got tired and decided it was easier to just declare me dead?" Her tone was sharp. "Do you know what it was like for me? Surviving the accident, thinking I'd make it home, only to find out that you stopped looking for me. Do you know what it's like to be forgotten?" Victor struggled to rise, leaning on his cane. His physical frailty contrasted with the intensity of his words. "I never forgot you. I never stopped thinking about you, loving you. Every day, every night, my life stopped with you, Laura. You may not believe it, but you were my everything. And losing you was like losing a part of myself." Laura stood silent for a moment, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. But the anger was still there, fueled by years of accumulated pain. "And what about her?" she finally said, pointing at Emma, who flinched slightly under Laura's intense gaze. "What role does she play in all of this?" Victor took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Emma isn't a replacement, Laura. She could never be. She came into my life at a time when everything seemed lost, when I thought I'd never feel anything more than emptiness. She's not here to take your place, but to remind me that there's still life to live, still love to give." Laura looked at Emma with distrust, as if trying to see through her. For Emma, the situation was overwhelming. She hadn't wanted to get involved in such a complicated emotional battle, but now she was right in the middle of it. "I'm not here to take anything from you," Emma said, her voice trembling but sincere. "I just tried to help him. I don't know how I got here, but I don't want to hurt you." Emma's words seemed to disarm Laura for a moment, but the weight of her resentment was still evident. "Help him," Laura repeated with an acid tone. "You think this is helping, becoming some kind of shadow of what I was. How am I supposed to deal with that?" Victor stepped toward his daughter, extending a trembling hand. "Laura, please. This isn't about replacements or shadows. It's about me wanting to make peace with you. I don't know how to fix all the damage I caused, but I'm willing to try, if you'll let me." For the first time, Laura's strength seemed to waver. She closed her eyes, as if trying to contain a wave of emotions threatening to overflow. Finally, she took a deep breath and turned toward the window, her voice softer, but still tense. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad. Not yet. But I want to understand. I want to know why you made the choices you did. And I need time to process all of this." Victor nodded, relieved that at least Laura was willing to talk. "Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'll always be here for you. Always." Laura didn't respond immediately, but her rigid posture began to relax slightly. Emma, who had been silent, felt that something was changing in the air. Though the wounds were still fresh, This confrontation had been a necessary step to start healing them. That night, Emma stayed awake for a long time, reflecting on what had happened. On one hand, she felt guilty for being part of something so personal for Victor and Laura. On the other hand, she couldn't deny that she wanted to stay and help, even though she didn't know how. In her room, Laura looked at one of the childhood photos Clara had left on the table. In her mind, the image of her father blended with the fragile man she had found upon returning. Despite her resentment, a small part of her wanted to believe Victor's words, the possibility of rebuilding something of what they had lost. The mansion, with its solemn air and filled with memories, became a place of introspection for everyone that night. Though the road to reconciliation was uncertain, there was a glimmer of hope in the air, as if the wounds, though deep, could start to heal. The night had fallen over the mansion, wrapping it in almost complete silence. The fireplace in the study crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls as Laura sat in front of Victor. They were both in the study, separated by a small wooden table that held a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses, though neither of them had touched the drink. The atmosphere was tense, laden with unasked questions and unshared memories. After the confrontation that afternoon, Laura had decided to stay a little longer, but her cold gaze indicated she wasn't there to reconcile, at least not immediately. "Tell me the truth," Laura began, breaking the silence with a firm voice. "What happened after the accident? I want to know exactly why you decided I was dead." Victor sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. The fragility of his body seemed to intensify under the weight of his own memories. "It wasn't an easy decision, Laura," he finally said, his voice heavy with pain. "The accident was chaos. They told us the boat had sunk and that there was little hope of finding survivors. They found the boat's remains, but you weren't there. They searched for days, but the search yielded no results." Laura watched him impassively as he continued. "I hired the best rescue teams. I put out ads, offered rewards. I did everything I could, but over time, the world forced me to accept that you weren't coming back. It wasn't because I wanted to, Laura. It was because I didn't know how to keep living in that uncertainty." Laura let out a bitter laugh, crossing her arms. "So you just gave up? Because that's what it felt like, as if you got tired of searching and decided to move on." "I didn't move on," Victor exclaimed, with an intensity that surprised both of them. "I never did. My life stopped with you. Everything I did after that was just surviving, not living." Laura looked away, struggling against the tears that threatened to spill. The barrier she had built over the years was beginning to crack, but she wasn't ready to let it fall completely. "You didn't find me because you didn't search hard enough," she said, her tone softer, but still filled with reproach. Victor leaned toward her, his voice now full of pleading. "Where were you, Laura? What happened to you? I spent years imagining all the possibilities, and each one tormented me. Please, tell me the truth." Laura took a deep breath, and her face showed a mix of sadness and contained anger. "The day of the accident, I was swept away by the current. I don't remember much after that, just that I woke up on a strange beach. Some fishermen found me and took me to their village. I was weak, confused, and at first, I couldn't remember anything, not even my own name." Victor stared at her, his expression a mix of shock and horror. "Did you lose your memory?" Laura nodded slowly. "Yes. For months, I didn't know who I was. The family that took me in gave me a name, cared for me as if I were their daughter, and little by little I started to rebuild a life. But when my memory came back, over a year had passed. I tried to come home, Dad. I tried. But when I searched for information about you, about our family, all I found was your public acceptance of my death." Victor placed a hand over his chest, as if those words had pierced his heart. "I thought you didn't love me enough to keep looking for me," Laura continued, tears falling down her cheeks. "I thought there was no place for me here anymore." Victor shook his head, tears filling his own eyes. "Laura, I never stopped loving you. Everything I did, every decision I made, was because of the pain of not having you. If I had known, if I had imagined that you were alive." Laura leaned toward him, her face filled with conflicting emotions. "And what about now? What about all of this?" she said, pointing toward the door, as if Emma were standing right there. "Why did you bring that girl into your life? Was she another way of replacing me?" Victor took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before responding. "No, Laura. It was never about replacing you. Emma came into my life when I was at my lowest. She reminded me of what it was like to care for someone, to share moments with another person. But I never, not for a second, stopped loving you or wishing for your return." The silence that followed was heavy, but not entirely hostile. Laura looked at her father, seeing for the first time not just the man who had disappointed her, but also someone who had suffered just as much as she had. "I want to believe it, Dad," she finally said. "I want to try, but I don't know if I can. Not yet." Victor nodded, accepting her words with a mix of relief and sadness. "I understand, Laura, and I'll be here, waiting for as long as you need." Later that night, Laura sat alone in her old room, gazing at the walls still decorated with childhood memories. In the back of her mind, Victor's words echoed alongside Emma's sincere gaze. There was so much to process, so much to decide, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. In his own room, Victor looked at a portrait of Laura as a child, his fingers tenderly caressing the frame. Despite the painful conversation they'd had, there was a spark of hope inside him. His daughter was alive, and though the road to reconciliation would be long, he had something he hadn't had in a long time: a second chance. Days in the mansion passed with a strange mix of tensions and moments of calm. Laura, Victor, and Emma all lived under the same roof, but the emotions they shared were like underground rivers, deep, powerful, and often unreadable. Every interaction was charged with unspoken meanings, as if one wrong word could break the fragile balance they were maintaining. Laura, though still distant, began to observe Emma more closely. At first, her gaze was filled with distrust, almost resentment, but over time, she started noticing things she had previously overlooked. The way Emma would draw at night, always with a concentrated and almost nostalgic expression, or how she helped Victor with small gestures, like handing him his cane or covering him with a blanket when he fell asleep on the couch. On the other hand, Emma was also conflicted. Though she had come to the mansion as part of a practical arrangement, she now felt something deeper for Victor. She wasn't a replacement for Laura, but he made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. Yet, Laura's presence complicated everything. Emma didn't want to be an obstacle between father and daughter, but she also didn't want to abandon the relationship she had started to build with Victor. The tension reached a critical point one afternoon in the library. Victor had suggested that the three of them work together on a project, reorganizing the books by Laura's favorite genres, an activity he hoped would bring them closer. At first, the task seemed promising. Emma and Laura worked in silence, each focused on her own corner, while Victor sat in an armchair supervising with a faint smile. But soon, the atmosphere grew heavier. Laura found a children's book with her name written on the first page, a memento from her childhood that visibly affected her. "This was mine," she said, looking at Victor with a mix of sadness and accusation. Victor nodded, his voice soft. "I kept it for you. I always thought you would come back and read it one day." Laura slammed the book onto the table with more force than necessary. "And then what? Did you give up and start filling the house with things for someone else?" she asked, shooting a direct look at Emma. Emma, who had been silent up until that point, looked up, surprised by Laura's tone. "I'm not here to replace you," she said calmly but firmly. "You know that, right?" Laura crossed her arms, her expression still hard. "I don't know, Emma. All of this," she gestured broadly, encompassing the room. What am I supposed to make of it? My place in this house, in his life, is no longer clear. Victor intervened before the situation could escalate further. "Enough!" he exclaimed, with more force than his body seemed capable of. "No one is here to replace anyone. Laura, Emma is not a threat to you. And Emma, you don't have to justify your place here. Both of you mean something to me in different ways. Is that so hard to understand?" Victor's words left both of them in silence. Laura, though still upset, began to notice the weary expression on her father's face, the effort it took him to maintain peace between them. Emma, on the other hand, felt a slight relief at hearing Victor defend her, but also a growing guilt for being a source of tension in his relationship with Laura. Later, Clara found Emma in the garden, sitting under the tree that Victor and Laura had planted so many years ago. The girl was drawing again, this time a portrait of the three of them together, though her lines seemed more uncertain than usual. "Looks like you had a tough day," Clara said, sitting next to her. Emma sighed, not taking her eyes off her drawing. "I don't know what I'm doing here, Clara. I feel like I'm in the middle of something that doesn't belong to me." Clara gave her an understanding look. "You're here because Victor needs you, but I also think Laura needs you, even if she doesn't know it. You both have something to learn from each other." Emma frowned, confused. What could she learn from me? This is her family, not mine. Clara smiled slightly. Sometimes, what we need the most doesn't come from our family, but from people who show us different perspectives. You may not see it now, but your presence here is changing something in all of us. Meanwhile, Laura was in her room, holding the children's book she had found in the library. Her fingers traced the cover, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of the happy memories she had shared with her father. But at the same time, a pang of jealousy and guilt swept over her when she thought of Emma. Why was it so hard to accept that the girl could have a place in Victor's life without threatening her own? That night, as the lights in the mansion slowly went out one by one, a fragile understanding began to form between the three of them. Although the wounds of the past were still open and the emotions intense, there was something undeniable in their connection, a conscious or unconscious desire to heal, to rebuild something from the ruins. The emotional triangle that bound them wasn't easy to manage, but perhaps in that complexity lay the key to moving forward. The mansion woke up to a quieter atmosphere the next day, though the air was still heavy with the emotions of the previous days. Laura and Emma continued to avoid direct confrontations, but both seemed more aware of each other's presence. Deep down, each knew that Victor was at the center of it all, and that any misstep could hurt him even more. Clara, who had witnessed the recent events, decided to intervene subtly. Seeing how both of them kept busy with separate tasks, she came up with an idea to bring them together, if only for a moment. "Emma, Laura, I need help in the library," Clara said that morning as she organized the lower bookshelves. "There are many old texts that need to be restored and arranged. You both could work together on this." Both women looked at each other, surprised by the proposal, but there was no way to refuse the request without seeming rude. So, with a mix of resignation and curiosity, they began the task. The library, with its smell of wood and aged paper, filled with the soft sound of pages turning and pencils writing labels. At first, the silence between Laura and Emma was almost oppressive. Each focused on her task, avoiding starting a conversation that could turn uncomfortable. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "You're good at drawing," she said, pointing to a notebook that Emma had left near the shelves. Emma looked up, surprised by the comment. "Thanks," she replied cautiously. Laura picked up the notebook and flipped through it, stopping at one particular drawing, a portrait of Victor sitting under the tree in the garden. "You captured his expression perfectly," she said, with a tone that was neither complimentary nor critical, but genuinely thoughtful. Emma shrugged. "It's what I see when I look at him." Laura put the notebook back on the table and looked at Emma with an expression softer than usual. He means a lot to you, doesn't he? Emma nodded slowly. He's different from anyone I've known. He treats me like he actually cares. That doesn't happen much in my life. Laura fell silent for a moment, processing Emma's words. There was something disarming in the girl's sincerity, something that made it hard to keep the barriers she had built in place. It wasn't always like that, you know, Laura continued, looking at a shelf full of children's books. When I was a kid, he was too busy to be with me most of the time. Now it seems like he's trying to make up for all of that with you. Emma, sensing the melancholy in Laura's voice, decided to speak carefully. Maybe he's trying to fix it, with you too. Laura didn't answer, but something in her eyes reflected that Emma's words had reached her. In the afternoon, Clara suggested they plant some flowers around the tree that Laura and Victor had planted years ago. Although at first both hesitated, they accepted the idea and joined the project. As they worked in silence, Laura noticed how Emma, though clearly inexperienced, put effort into every detail. You don't have to make it perfect, Laura remarked with a small smile. Just make sure the plant has enough soil around it. Emma nodded, grateful for the advice. I've never done anything like this before, she admitted. In the city, there's not much space for things like this. Laura looked at her, a flicker of empathy in her eyes. I didn't do this much either. It was more my dad's thing. I just went along because he liked it. They shared a brief smile, and for the first time, the atmosphere between them felt less tense. Later, as they finished planting the flowers, Victor came out to the garden and observed them from a distance. Although his movements were slow and his face showed signs of weariness, his eyes gleamed with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It's a start, he murmured to himself, a slight smile forming on his lips. Unaware that Victor was watching them, Laura and Emma continued working together, their interactions now more fluid and natural. Though there were still barriers between them, the first bridges were beginning to form. And although those bridges were fragile, they represented an important step toward the possibility of a deeper connection. When they finished, they stood back and looked at their work, a small circle of flowers surrounding the tree, like a symbol of renewal. It doesn't look that bad, right? Emma said. Laura nodded, her smile more genuine this time. No, it doesn't look bad at all. And with those few words, they both began to accept that perhaps there was a place for each of them in the other's life, and that together they could start healing the wounds of the past. The mansion was wrapped in a deep silence as night fell. Emma, unable to sleep, wandered through the dark hallways, guided by the soft light filtering from the library. There was something comforting about that place, the high shelves full of books, the smell of old paper, and the gentle echo of her own footsteps on the carpet. It was as if that space embraced her, offering a refuge amidst all the confusion surrounding her. Upon entering, she noticed she wasn't alone. Laura was sitting at one of the large tables, surrounded by books and papers. The warm light from a desk lamp illuminated her face, which was absorbed in a photo album that Victor had left in the library. Emma hesitated for a moment, but eventually decided to approach. Can't sleep? Emma asked, breaking the silence. Laura looked up, surprised by the interruption, but not upset. No, she replied, slowly closing the album. I guess there's just too much on my mind. Emma nodded and sat in a nearby chair. For a moment, neither spoke, letting the soft crackle of the fire in the fireplace fill the space. What are you looking at? Emma asked, pointing to the album. Laura hesitated before pushing it toward her. Inside, there were photos from her childhood, pictures of her playing in the garden, sitting next to Victor in the library, and even a few of her mother, whose face Emma had never seen before. It's strange, Laura said with a melancholic smile, looking at these pictures and remembering how things were before, and how everything changed so quickly. Emma turned the pages carefully, seeing the story of a life that seemed so different from her own. It looks like you had a beautiful family, she commented softly. Laura let out a sigh. It was, at times. But there were also a lot of things that weren't right. My dad. He was always busy. He worked so much that sometimes I felt like he wasn't really there. Now, seeing him like this, so fragile, it's hard to reconcile that with the man he used to be. Emma looked at her, feeling an unexpected connection to her words. I guess it's hard for everyone. I mean, I never had a family like this, but even the good things seem complicated sometimes. Laura nodded, understanding Emma's sincerity. I guess you're right. The conversation flowed more naturally from that point. Laura shared stories of her childhood, both happy and not so happy moments, while Emma listened attentively. Then, it was Emma's turn. Hesitantly, she spoke about her life on the streets, the tough days, and the small joys she found in simple things like drawing or taking care of her cat, Tigre. Though they came from completely different worlds, they found common ground: loneliness, the need to belong, and the desire to connect with something or someone. At some point during the night, Laura found a book that had been one of her childhood favorites. It was a story about a girl who traveled through magical worlds in search of her home. Without thinking too much, she began reading it aloud, her soft voice filling the library with words that seemed to have a special meaning for both of them. Emma, curled up in a nearby armchair, listened with a smile. There was something comforting in Laura's voice, as if the story she was telling was hers too. You know, Emma said when Laura finished, I think that story isn't just about finding a place. It's about finding the people who make that place feel like home. Laura looked at her, surprised by the depth of Emma's words. Maybe you're right, she replied with a small smile. When they finally decided to go to bed, both felt that something had changed between them. The walls that had separated them hadn't disappeared entirely, but they were beginning to crack. The night in the library had been a small step towards something bigger, something that they were both still discovering. As they said goodnight in the hallway, Laura paused for a moment and looked at Emma. Thanks for tonight. I didn't think I'd be able to talk like this with anyone. Emma smiled, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. Me neither. And with those words, they both retreated to their rooms, knowing that, although the road ahead was still uncertain, they were beginning to build something that could last beyond the mansion and their shared wounds. The morning slowly rose over the mansion, with the distant sound of birds breaking the silence. Victor was in his study, staring at the wooden box he had kept for years. The letters, carefully written and tied with a faded ribbon, had been his refuge during the long nights of solitude. Now, for the first time, he was ready to share them. Laura entered the study, having been informed by Clara that her father wanted to speak with her privately. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and suspicion, though there was a hint of openness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "What did you want to tell me, Dad?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Victor took a moment to respond, his fingers tracing the surface of the box. "There's something I've kept for many years," he began, his voice laden with emotion. "Something I never thought I'd have the chance to show you." He carefully opened the box and pushed it toward Laura. She looked at the letters, immediately recognizing her father's handwriting. She took the first one with trembling hands and began to read silently. Victor watched every movement, his heart beating loudly as he waited for her reaction. "My dear Laura," the first letter began, "today was another day without you, and the emptiness you left keeps growing. I wake up every morning hoping this is just a bad dream, but the weight of your absence always catches up to me. If I could go back in time, I would hold you tighter, tell you how much you mean to me. I miss you more than words can express." Laura read slowly, her face changing with every line. The hardness she had carried with her for years began to crumble. The letters were undeniable proof of the love and guilt that had consumed Victor since her disappearance. "I wrote one every time I couldn't bear the silence," Victor explained, his eyes filled with tears. "It was my way of keeping you alive in my mind, of telling you the things I could never say in person." Laura put the letter down on the table and took another one. Each word felt like an echo of the pain Victor had felt in her absence, but also a declaration of love that he had never doubted, but that she needed to hear. "Why didn't you ever talk to me about this before?" she asked finally, her voice cracking. "Because I never thought I'd have the chance to give them to you," Victor replied. "For me, these letters were my only way of moving forward. But now that you're here, I want you to read them. I want you to know that I never stopped loving you." Laura took another letter, but this time she couldn't finish it. Tears began to fall from her cheeks as her father's words reached her in a way no conversation ever had. Victor stood up slowly and moved toward her, resting a trembling hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, I haven't been the father you needed," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But if you give me the chance, I want to be that father now." Laura looked up, her eyes filled with emotions she couldn't express with words. Finally, she stood up and hugged her father, a gesture that seemed to hold all the years of distance and silence between them. "I believe you, Dad," she whispered. "I don't know if I can forgive everything right away, but I want to try." Victor nodded, his tears mixing with Laura's. "That's more than I could have ever hoped for." Emma, who had been wandering through the mansion, stopped as she passed by the study. Through the slightly open door, she saw Laura and Victor embracing. The scene moved her in a way she hadn't expected, and she decided to leave them in their private moment. Though she still wasn't sure exactly where she fit in this family, she knew something important had changed. That night, Laura took the box of letters to her room. She spent hours reading each one, crying and laughing as she found small anecdotes her father had written down. It was like rediscovering a man who had been a stranger to her for so long. When she finally closed the last letter, she felt lighter, as if part of the weight she had carried for years had disappeared. Although the road to reconciliation was still long, her father's words had planted something new in her: hope. In the silence of the mansion, each member of this makeshift family began to build bridges to one another, knowing that, although the past couldn't be changed, the future was still full of possibilities. The sun slowly rose over the mansion's gardens, bathing them in a warm light that seemed to herald an important day. Victor had asked to meet with Laura and Emma in the main hall that morning. Though both knew his health was deteriorating, they couldn't help but feel intrigued by the seriousness in his voice when he asked them to be there. When they entered, they found him sitting in his favorite armchair, a couple of legal documents on a table in front of him. Clara stood nearby, observing with a mixture of sadness and pride. Victor looked up, his eyes shining with determination despite the evident fatigue in his face. "I want to talk to you about something I've been thinking about for a long time," he began, his voice slow but firm. "My life has been complicated, full of mistakes and regrets. But I've also had moments of great love and joy. You two are the reason those moments have come back to me in these last few days." Laura and Emma exchanged glances, unsure of where Victor was heading. "I've decided," he continued, pointing to the documents, "that I want to divide my inheritance between the two of you." The announcement fell like a bombshell in the room. Laura frowned, clearly surprised, while Emma's eyes widened, unable to process what she had just heard. "What?" Laura exclaimed, unable to contain herself. "Are you saying you're going to give part of your inheritance to Emma? Dad, this doesn't make sense." Victor raised a hand to calm her. "Please, let me explain. This isn't just about money or property. It's about what you two represent to me. Laura, you are my daughter, my greatest love, and my greatest regret. There is nothing in this world that could compare to what you mean to me." He then turned to Emma, whose expression was a mix of surprise and nervousness. "And you, Emma, came into my life at a time when everything seemed lost. You gave me a reason to keep going, to open my heart again. Even though you're not my blood, you've been an important part of my life, and I want that reflected in my legacy." Laura pressed her lips together, struggling to contain a wave of contradictory emotions. On one hand, she understood what her father was trying to do. On the other, she couldn't help but feel that this gesture diminished her place in Victor's life. "This isn't fair, Dad," she finally said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I'm your daughter. I've spent years believing I would never see you again. And now I have to share all this with someone you don't even really know?" Emma, who had remained silent until now, looked up and spoke with a trembling voice. "I don't want any of this, Laura. I'm not here to take what belongs to you. If this bothers you, I can leave." Victor quickly shook his head. "No, Emma. That's not what I want. And Laura, I understand how you feel. But this isn't about dividing or replacing. This is about uniting. I want both of you to understand that you are important to me, and that even though I made this decision in an unusual way, I know it's the right one." Laura took a deep breath, her mind full of doubts and resentments. But something in her father's gaze, in his sincerity, made her stop. She knew he was speaking from the heart. "I can't promise that I'll agree with this right now," she said finally, with a mixture of firmness and vulnerability. "But I'll try to understand." Victor nodded, relieved. "That's all I ask." Later, as Laura and Emma strolled through the gardens, the silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. Finally, Laura spoke. "It wasn't easy for me to hear that, you know," she admitted, looking at the flowers they had planted together days earlier. "But I understand why you're important to him." Emma, who had been looking down at her feet, looked up. "I don't want to cause any problems, Laura. I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to help him." Laura nodded slowly, considering her words. "Maybe it's not as simple as dividing what he left. Maybe it's a way of showing us that we can still build something together. For him." Emma smiled shyly, feeling for the first time that Laura was truly seeing her, not as an intruder, but as someone who could share a common purpose. "We can try," Emma said. Laura looked at the tree that held so many memories with her father and nodded. "Yes, we can try." Although the bridges between them were still fragile, there was a new willingness to strengthen them, a desire to honor Victor's wishes and perhaps find something bigger in the process. As they walked together toward the mansion, both knew that, though the past couldn't be changed, the future was still full of possibilities. The morning was clear and fresh, and the mansion seemed to breathe a calmness it hadn't felt in a long time. In the grand hall, Victor watched from his armchair as Laura and Emma worked together, reorganizing the library. Although their movements were still a bit clumsy and their interactions marked by some discomfort, something in the scene filled him with hope. "Are you sure this goes here?" Emma asked, holding a leather-bound book with golden letters engraved on the cover. Laura, standing on a stepladder, quickly flipped through a catalogue of antique books before responding. "Yes, it belongs in the poetry section. What surprises me is that it's still here after all these years." "Why?" Emma asked, placing the book on the shelf Laura had indicated. "Because it was one of my mom's favorites. I thought it would have been lost when they renovated this wing of the house." Laura looked at the shelf for a moment, lost in her memories. "She used to read me poetry when I was a little girl." Emma, who had never heard anyone talk about Laura's mother until then, felt a pang of curiosity. However, she chose not to press. Instead, she picked up another book from the stack they were organizing and held it up in front of Laura. "And this one?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Laura looked down and immediately recognized the title. "It's a collection of children's stories. My dad used to read them to me when he had time, although it wasn't very often." She paused and then, in a softer tone, added, "But when he did, it was special." Emma nodded, sensing the mix of nostalgia and melancholy in Laura's words. As the day went on, the task of restoring the library began to flow more smoothly. The barriers between Laura and Emma seemed to slowly fade away, replaced by small conversations and occasional comments that brought genuine smiles. "How did you learn to draw so well?" Laura asked at one point, flipping through one of Emma's sketchbooks she had found on the table. Emma, who was dusting off a row of books on the bottom shelf, shrugged. I don't know. I guess I always liked it. It was my way of escaping when things were tough. When I drew, I could create a world better than the one I had. Laura nodded, understanding more than she expected. Though their lives had been completely different, both seemed to have found comfort in small acts of creativity. Well, you have talent, Laura said, smiling without trying to hide it. Thank you, Emma replied, feeling an unexpected warmth at the compliment. In the afternoon, Victor decided to join them. Though he couldn't move as quickly as before, he insisted on participating in the task. When Laura and Emma saw him enter, they immediately offered to help him settle into a nearby chair. With a smile, he picked up a book from the stack and began reading aloud a passage he had found. Life is not measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away, he read, looking up at both of them. They both fell silent for a moment, processing the words. Finally, Emma spoke. I guess I've had a few moments like that lately, she said with a shy smile. Laura looked at her father, her eyes filled with emotions she couldn't fully express. Though the words were simple, the meaning behind them resonated deeply in her heart. So have I, she admitted, her voice barely audible. When they finished organizing the books, the library seemed transformed. The shelves were clean and orderly, and the light coming through the windows gave the space a warm, welcoming feel. Laura and Emma, though tired, shared a smile of satisfaction. We did a good job, Laura said, looking around. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad, Emma replied, with a hint of pride. Victor, sitting in his chair, watched the scene with a mixture of joy and gratitude. For the first time in years, his library was not just filled with books, but with life. Thank you, both of you, he said, his voice laden with emotion. This means more to me than you can imagine. Laura walked over and placed a hand on her father's shoulder. Thank you for giving us this place. And this time. Emma, who was standing on the other side, nodded silently. Though she still wasn't sure exactly where her place in this makeshift family was, she knew she was beginning to find it. That night, as the mansion settled into silence, the library stood as a symbol of what they were building together, a space filled with memories, but also with new possibilities. Although the road to reconciliation wasn't easy, each step brought them closer to being something more than strangers united by pain. They were starting to become a family. The day broke with a clear sky and a fresh breeze that caressed the mansion's gardens. Victor, sitting in his armchair near the windows, looked at the tree he had planted with Laura years ago. An idea had been swirling in his mind for days, and now he knew it was the right time to carry it out. Clara, call Laura and Emma, please. I want to talk to them in the garden, he said, his voice livelier than usual. Soon after, Laura and Emma met him in the center of the garden, where Victor was waiting next to a small hole that someone had already dug. Beside it, there was a young tree with its roots wrapped in burlap. What's this? Laura asked, raising an eyebrow, intrigued. I want us to plant this tree together, Victor replied with a warm smile. It's a symbol of what we're building here, of what we can still build. Emma looked at the tree with curiosity, while Laura kept a thoughtful expression. Victor continued. The tree we planted years ago, Laura, was always a reminder of our connection. But I think now it's time to do something new, something that represents not just the past, but the future. A future where we all have a place. There was a brief silence before Laura approached the young tree and knelt beside the hole. All right, Dad, let's do it. Emma, still unsure of her role in all this, quickly joined in, feeling that this gesture was bigger than anything she could express with words. The three generations worked together, carefully digging and ensuring the tree's roots were properly planted. Victor, though physically weak, insisted on participating, using a small shovel to help. His face reflected a mix of joy and nostalgia. When I was a child, Mom always said that trees were like families, Laura commented while placing soil around the roots. They grow better when they're together, sharing the same soil. Wise woman, Victor replied with a melancholic smile. Emma, who didn't usually share much about her past, spoke timidly. I've never planted anything before. In the city, there isn't much space for things like this. Laura looked at her with empathy. Well, this one is as much yours as ours. It's a good way to start. Emma nodded, feeling for the first time that she was truly part of something important. When they finished, the three of them stood staring at the young tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Victor placed a hand on each of their shoulders. This tree will be our legacy, he said, his voice full of emotion. Every time you look at it, I want you to remember this moment and what it means. Laura and Emma nodded, both deeply moved by the gesture. Though Victor's words carried a sense of finality, they also conveyed hope and unity. That evening, the makeshift family gathered in the dining room for a quiet dinner. The atmosphere was light, almost festive, and Emma and Laura's laughter filled the space, something Victor hadn't heard in a long time. After dinner, Laura accompanied Victor back to his room. While helping him settle into bed, she whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Victor took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you, my daughter, for giving me a second chance." Emma, for her part, went out to the garden after dinner. She sat under the newly planted tree and took out her sketchbook. By the light of the moon, she began to draw lines that represented what she felt. A tree whose roots intertwined with those of a larger one, showing how new life could grow even amidst pain. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt that she truly belonged somewhere. Though there were still unanswered questions and wounds to heal, she knew that this tree and the family that had planted it were the beginning of something beautiful. In the mansion, the air was filled with a renewed calm, as if the seeds of hope they had planted were also beginning to bloom in everyone's hearts. Time in the mansion began to move at a slower pace, as though the world itself were preparing for a farewell. Victor, who had shown renewed vitality in recent weeks, began to decline. His steps grew slower, his moments of clarity more infrequent, and his hands, once firm, now trembled, even when holding a cup of tea. Laura and Emma noticed it almost at the same time. At first, the changes were subtle, an occasional complaint of tiredness or a cough that wouldn't go away. But soon, the signs became impossible to ignore. Victor spent more time in his room, surrounded by objects that brought him comfort, photographs, old books, and carefully stored memories. One afternoon, while Emma was bringing him a tray with tea and cookies, she found him sitting by the window, looking out at the gardens with a distant expression. "How are you feeling today?" she asked, setting the tray on a nearby table. Victor smiled weakly, though his eyes reflected deep exhaustion. "I feel at peace, Emma, but I also know my time here is limited." Emma stayed silent, the weight of his words settling over her. Though she knew this was inevitable, hearing Victor speak of his own mortality filled her with a sadness she couldn't express. "You still need us here, right?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. Victor nodded and took her hand with the little strength he had left. "More than I can express. You two have made these last days the most meaningful of my life." On the other hand, Laura faced her father's fragility with a mix of acceptance and resistance. Though she knew she couldn't change what was happening, she felt that every moment spent with him was an opportunity to reclaim lost time. She spent her mornings organizing his medication, making sure he was comfortable, and the afternoons sitting beside him, listening to his stories or simply enjoying the shared silence. One night, while helping him settle into bed, Victor looked at her with tenderness. "I'm proud of you, Laura," he said, his voice breaking. "No matter how much time has passed, I've always known you're stronger than you think." Laura, who rarely let her vulnerability show, leaned in and hugged him tightly. "I love you, Dad, and I'm not ready to let you go." Victor gently stroked her hair. I know, daughter, but sometimes what's hardest for us is what we need to do the most. Emma and Laura began to share the responsibility of caring for Victor, which brought them even closer. Though there were still moments of tension, they now understood each other better, and both were committed to making Victor's last days as meaningful as possible. One afternoon, while the two of them were in the kitchen preparing a soup that Victor had requested, Emma broke the silence. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they hadn't found me on the street that day, she said, her eyes fixed on the carrots she was chopping. I can't imagine what my life would be like now. Laura looked at her, setting aside the knife she was holding. I think things happen for a reason, she replied, with a sincerity that surprised both of them. If you hadn't been here, I don't know if I could have faced all of this alone. Emma smiled, grateful for Laura's words. I guess we're learning to be a family, huh? Laura nodded, her expression softening. Yeah, I think we are. That night, Victor asked to be taken to the balcony to look at the stars. With Laura and Emma's help, he settled into a chair covered with a blanket. The cool air and the sight of the clear sky seemed to give him an energy he hadn't shown in days. I've always been fascinated by the stars, he said with a serene voice. They remind me that, even in the deepest darkness, there's always light. Laura and Emma sat beside him, sharing the moment in silence. Though Victor's decline was evident, his spirit remained strong. And in that instant, beneath the shimmering cloak of the night sky, the three souls connected in a way that transcended words. It was a reminder that, although Victor's time on Earth was running out, his legacy and the connections he had built would continue to blossom. And as the stars shone above them, they all knew that, though the end was near, the love they shared would give them the strength to face it together. The evening sun bathed the mansion in warm, golden light as Laura and Emma helped Victor settle on the balcony of his room. He insisted on spending the afternoon outdoors, looking at the gardens he loved and feeling the fresh air one last time. Though his body was weak, his eyes shone with an intensity that revealed he had something important to say. Thank you for bringing me here, he said with a weak smile as Laura adjusted a blanket over his legs. Today I want to talk to you, really. There are things I need to say before it's too late. Emma and Laura exchanged glances and both sat beside him, knowing this moment was crucial. Victor began by looking at Laura, his lost and then found daughter. The emotion on his face was palpable as he spoke. Laura, my love, there are no words enough to express what you mean to me. Losing you was like losing a part of my soul. And though I never stopped searching for you in my heart, I know I failed in many things. I failed as a father, and for that, I ask for your forgiveness. Laura, with tears in her eyes, shook her head. Dad, you don't have to ask for forgiveness. We've already been through that. Now I just want you to know that I love you, and despite everything, I'm grateful for this second chance. Victor took her hand with the little strength he had left and smiled, his eyes full of gratitude. Having you here, hearing you say that, is everything I've ever wanted. Then he turned his head toward Emma, who was looking at him with a mix of sadness and admiration. And you, Emma, have been an unexpected blessing. You came into my life when I needed it most, when I thought I would never feel love or purpose again. You gave me a second chance to be a father, to take care of someone, and for that, I will always be grateful. Emma, trying to hold back her tears, took Victor's free hand. I'm grateful to you too, Victor. You gave me a home when I had nothing, and you showed me that love can come in ways we don't expect. I will never forget what you've done for me. Victor smiled, though a silent tear slid down his cheek. You two are my greatest joy and my greatest legacy. I want you to know that, even though my time here is running out, I carry you both in my heart. And more importantly, I want you to take care of each other. What we've built together must not disappear with my departure. Laura and Emma nodded, and without words, both took Victor's hand at the same time, forming a circle that seemed to seal their promise. As the sun set on the horizon, leaving the sky painted in shades of orange and purple, the silence between them was not uncomfortable, but filled with meaning. Each of them understood what that moment represented. A goodbye, but also a beginning. "Look at the stars," Victor finally said, pointing to the clearing night sky. "When I'm no longer here, remember that there will always be light, even in the darkest moments." The words resonated deeply with both of them. Although the weight of the impending farewell was overwhelming, they found comfort in knowing that the love they shared would be a guide, even after Victor was gone. That night, as the cold intensified, Laura and Emma helped him back to his bed. Though he could hardly speak, Victor had a peaceful expression on his face, as though he knew he had said everything he needed to say. In the silence of the room, both stayed by his side, holding his hands and sharing the vigil. Because, although the end was near, they knew they would face it together, just as he had asked. Dawn arrived with an unusual softness, as if even nature knew that this day marked an end. The soft light of the sun filtered through the curtains in Victor's room, bathing everything in golden tones. Laura and Emma were by his side, sitting in silence, each holding one of his hands. The air was heavy, but not with sadness, rather with a solemn calm, as if time itself had decided to pause for a moment. Victor, pale but with a serene expression, slowly opened his eyes. He looked at his two daughters, one by blood, the other by heart, and a faint smile crossed his face. "My warriors," he murmured, his voice barely audible but full of affection. Laura leaned in toward him, gripping his hand more tightly. Her eyes, full of tears, reflected love and profound sadness. "We're here, Dad," she whispered. "You're not alone." Emma, sitting on the other side of the bed, gently stroked Victor's hand. Though the words caught in her throat, she finally spoke. "We love you, Victor. We love you so much." Despite his fragility, Victor made an effort to speak, pausing between each phrase to catch his breath. "What we've built together is more than I could have ever dreamed. You've given me peace, love, and hope, when I thought everything was lost." Laura couldn't hold back the tears, but she smiled too, remembering how her father had changed since his return. "And you gave us a family, Dad. You gave us the chance to start over." Victor turned his head toward Emma, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Emma, never forget that you brought light into my life. You are part of this family. You always will be." Emma felt a lump form in her chest. Though tears ran down her face, she smiled sincerely. "I'll never forget everything you did for me, Victor. You will always be part of me." Silence once again filled the room, but this time it was full of meaning. Laura pulled out a book of poetry she had found days before in the library and began reading softly. The words, gentle and melancholic, seemed to float in the air, wrapping the three of them in a moment of pure intimacy. "Time stops where love remains. In every leaf, in every star, the echo of the beloved never disappears." Victor closed his eyes as Laura read, and a look of absolute peace spread across his face. His breathing, though slow and weak, became rhythmic, as if the words were leading him to a place beyond the mansion, beyond the pain. Meanwhile, Emma began to draw in her sketchbook. With soft, precise strokes, she captured the scene. The intertwined hands, Victor's serene face, and the ray of sunlight illuminating the room like a final blessing. When Victor's breathing stopped, it was so peaceful that, for a moment, both of them thought he was just sleeping. With a heavy heart, Laura placed her hand on his face and gently stroked it. "Goodbye, Dad," she murmured, as tears fell freely down her cheeks. Emma, unable to contain her own sadness, leaned over the bed and placed her drawing next to him, as a final gift. "Thank you for everything, Victor," she whispered. "You will always be with us." Clara entered the room shortly after, her face reflecting the pain she also felt. Upon seeing Laura and Emma together, surrounding Victor, she knew he had passed in peace, surrounded by the love he had always longed for. "He would be proud of both of you," she said softly, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "You've made his last days the most beautiful." Laura and Emma hugged each other, sharing their pain and their love for the man who had brought their lives together. Although the loss was immense, they both knew that Victor had left them something greater, a connection they now needed to protect and strengthen. That night, the mansion fell into a respectful silence, but in the garden, the tree they had planted together stood as a symbol of life and hope. Beneath its branches, Laura and Emma sat together, looking at the stars. "He will always be here," Laura said, pointing to the sky. "In the stars, in the wind, in us." Emma nodded, feeling for the first time that, although Victor was no longer physically present, his presence would continue to guide them. In that moment, both of them understood that the love he had given them would never disappear. It was an eternal legacy, planted in their hearts, like the tree in the garden. Laura found a new satisfaction in the human connections she had developed. One day, while reviewing documents in her office, a little girl came running in and hugged her. "Thank you, Mrs. Laura," said the girl, her face lighting up with a smile. "For everything." Laura, surprised but moved, returned the hug. "Thank you for trusting us." That moment confirmed what Laura had started to understand. Her life now had a purpose greater than anything she had ever imagined. One afternoon, as they planted flowers around Victor's tree, Emma stopped to admire how much it had grown. Its young branches stretched out strongly, and its leaves fluttered with the wind. "Do you remember when we planted it?" Emma asked, looking at Laura. "Of course," Laura replied, kneeling to adjust one of the plants. "It feels like it was a long time ago, but also as if it were just yesterday." Emma smiled. "It's strange, but sometimes I feel like he's here. Not physically, of course, but in all of this. In the children, in the center, in this tree." Laura paused for a moment and nodded. "I feel it too, and I think he would be happy to see what we've done." Both stood in silence, contemplating the tree that now represented not only Victor's memory, but also the bond they had formed as a family. That night, they celebrated the official opening of the center with a simple but emotional ceremony. Local children and families gathered in the garden, which was lit with soft lights. There was music, food, and above all, an energy of hope and community. Laura and Emma, standing together in front of the guests, took turns speaking. "This place wouldn't be possible without my father, Victor Johnson," Laura said, her voice filled with emotion. "He believed in second chances, in the importance of helping others, and in the power of love to heal. All of this is his legacy, but also the beginning of something new." Emma took the microphone, nervous at first, but with a warmth that quickly captured everyone's attention. "For me, this place is more than just a center. It's a home, and I want each one of you to know that there will always be a space here to dream, to learn, and to find hope." Applause filled the air, and as the garden lights shone over them, Laura and Emma hugged, knowing that Victor would be proud of what they had accomplished. At the end of the night, when all the guests had left, Laura and Emma walked through the garden, enjoying the peaceful silence. The lights of the center still shone, and Victor's tree stood tall under the moonlight, strong and full of life. "You know? I think this is just the beginning," Laura said, looking at Emma with a smile. "Yes," Emma replied, taking her hand, "and I think together we can do something amazing." Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you liked this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more content. See you next time. Take care, and until then.